This demo shows how to leverage Office 365 online and an on-premise solution like Dynamics GP.
In this two-part demo, I'm going to show you how to track employee expense reports by using Office 365. So let's first see how this expense report solution works. I'm logged in as Brian Cox, a sales manager at Fabricam, and I just finished attending a week-long business conference. While waiting for my return flight home, I want to enter and submit my expense report data. I've logged into my team site and located the expense report subsite. This site contains an interactive summary report of all expense reports created in Excel, an expense report template in Excel, a library of expense reports, and a SharePoint workflow. To get started, I click the link to the expense reports library in the navigation pane to the left, click the Documents tab, and then I click the New Documents command. Let's fill out the expense report. First things first, I'll add myself to the employee field, which is required. Note that the expense report is initially set to in progress, which just means I'm creating the expense report for the first time. The template makes sure I enter accurate dates. Finally, when I'm done entering my expenses, I save the file. Notice also how the Document Information panel updates with the current values from the spreadsheet. And because I've created a new item or document in the library, the workflow triggers. Here's where the fun begins. A SharePoint workflow is a no-code way to control and manage a business process. The workflow also handles the email communication between an employee and Chris Barry, our accountant. When I change the status field to submitted, the workflow automatically sends an email to Chris telling her the expense report is ready. Then I get an email telling me a reimbursement check is on its way.
The first thing we're going to do is create an expense report in Office 365. Then we're going to submit it to Workflow to our manager for approval. Once the manager approves it, the accounting department is going to review it, approve it, and then send it to Dynamics GP as an AP invoice. The AP invoice will get created automatically in Dynamics GP through one of the web services offered through Dynamics GP. And then the expense is completed and the employee is notified the expense has been processed. I'd like to spend a few moments and just set up my demo. I have two demos with the theme of island hopping in the cloud. The idea is that I have some information that would originate in the cloud in Office 365 and then seamlessly be moved on-premise. It would be a common theme. You know, one document may lead to another document to be processed. Here we have Office 365 living in an extranet, and I want to leverage Excel both in the cloud in Office 365 and on-premise. And on-premise I have Dynamics GP 2010 where I'm going to create an AP invoice. So the goal here is action something in the cloud and use Excel as a mechanism to bring that back from the cloud and get access to my intranet where Dynamics GP would be living in it from a secure way, be able to transition from extranet to intranet. The second part of this demo is a theme of the first part. Again, actioning Office 365, the expense report, up in the cloud and approving it, but using workflow to create a mail message that gets transported via mail to a SharePoint on-premise site and action that inside of an on-premise SharePoint implementation. So here we have SharePoint in the cloud, actioning declarative workflow using an expense report, and then bringing that back in to be actioned to create an AP invoice in Dynamics GP from an on-site implementation of SharePoint. Finally, without getting into the technical weeds, we always have to consider security. So each implementation would have to address the extranet intranet relationship, and realistically that would be through a firewall. Just a secure way to make sure that what lives on-premise is secure And then of course we have a secure mechanism to be able to get to the cloud and as well to return back information from the cloud. So the goal of this presentation is really just to think of some simple ways to be able to coexist a cloud offering, Office 365, with an on-premise in a hybrid model that allows us to action in one location and then resulting in action in an on-premise location, and some techniques that you might think about how we could do that. Let's open up our team site. Here we are in Office 365, and I've added a library to capture my expense reports called Fabricam Expense. I want to go to the Documents tab and select that to create a new expense report. Creating a document will bring up an expense report that I can fill out in Excel. Here we see almost complete report, and I've filled in a value for the vendor ID of the value of Tim, and this is the vendor that will be transferred over to Dynamics GP when we call the web service. Notice that the spreadsheet did a lookup of the value of the vendor to ensure that it was a good vendor, and returned back a value that says Tim is a good vendor from the lookup. Now we want to save this spreadsheet on Office 365 and begin the workflow process. The expense report is now in the library and workflow is started pending approval of the manager. Let's review and approve this expense report as the accounting user, and that will create an invoice in Dynamics GP. We approve the expense report, and now we'll complete some information in the accounting use only block. Completing this information will enable us to trigger an event to drive a AP invoice into Dynamics GP through a web service. We see the web service return a result code of 0, indicating that it created an AP invoice in Dynamics GP. The expense report now shows a status of posted, indicating that it posted to Dynamics GP. Now let's go look at that over in Dynamics GP. Let's look up in Dynamics GP the AP invoice that we just created. We now have an AP invoice ready to be paid to Tim for the purchase of the new computer. Let's do a quick recap and set up what we're going to do next. We just saw Excel being used as a bridge between Office 365 in the cloud and on-premise with Dynamics GP in a manual operation. The next part of this demo automates that. We actually will go through an approval process, again using Excel, but now we have workflow that happens in the cloud with Office 365 that sends a mail message over on-premise into SharePoint, where we then action and create an AP invoice automatically. So this is an automated approach versus the previous approach, which is really purely manual of bringing Excel on-premise and actioning from there. We're now going to take that same expense report and action that in a different way. We're going to put a value in the status field of auto post, and that's going to tell Office 365 workflow Do we want to send a mail message over to Dynamics GP and create an invoice through the on-premise implementation of SharePoint? The expense report is now back in the library, and Office 365 workflow has kicked off the Fabricam expense. You'll notice that says in progress. This is sending a mail message to the on-premise implementation of SharePoint that will allow us to action the create process for the AP invoice. The mail message has now been delivered to the workflow mailbox, and an on-premise service will pull that mail and submit that to SharePoint for processing the AP invoice in Dynamics GP. We're now seeing the on-premise implementation of SharePoint waiting for the mail to be received from the Office 365 mailbox. A quick refresh of the browser shows the mail coming into the mailbox and workflow starting on the on-premise SharePoint side to move that into Dynamics GP. The on-premise SharePoint process has now completed that workflow and submitted that AP invoice into Dynamics GP. The workflow updated the log with indication that it moved that invoice into Dynamics GP. Let's browse the AP invoice screen and see the invoice that we just created through the web service. We see the AP invoice is now in Dynamics GP, ready to pay Tim for the new computer. And the workflow that was sent from Office 365 into that mailbox, the workflow mailbox, is now empty because we moved that into SharePoint and then into Dynamics GP.